My task is to share information about canola fertility. At the early stages of our venture in the canola production in North Dakota, we relied very heavily on Canadian research, especially that in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And as time has gone on, there's been quite a few studies up in the northern tier of counties from Langdon and from Minot, and there's some studies in Hettinger too, because canola is always a presence in southwestern North Dakota, and those have really helped us to feel more confident about the Canadian recommendations, and also has helped us a lot in our modern interpretation of canola response to fertility. So with that in mind, I'm going to charge on here. Maybe. There we go. All right, so as you look at our recommendations, you can see that there's no request for yield goal, and that is true for all of our crops anymore, but it's particularly true for canola. That nitrogen really isn't related to yield of canola, and never was. There was some concern when people went from open pollinated varieties to hybrids that there'd be a difference in the nitrogen need, because the yields with the hybrids were higher, and it proved not to be the case. And I'll show you some evidence for that in just a minute. So for now, you can quasi trust me, and we divide the state in our recommendation circular, which will be provided to you by Greg and Hans after the session, into a cooler and moister part of the state generally, and a warmer and drier part of the state generally. And the nitrogen recommendation is higher in the cooler, wetter, and lower in the warmer, drier. And I hope that's kind of intuitive. So the recommendation is for 150 pounds of N less the credits for the cooler and moister, and 120 pounds of N in credits for the warmer and drier. Now, this doesn't appear in our recommendations, but I think as time goes on, it will, and you can consider this a bonus for you watching this training, that if I was in that Langdon area, which is shown in our wheat recommendations that were put together around 2010, that I would feel very confident shaving that 150 pounds down to 120 to 130. Confidently, and that's because the Langdon region soils are carved out not because of climate really, but because those areas are what was described about 40 years ago in an agronomy journal article from the state, that as a shaly area. And those of you that take soil samples in that area know that about every probe that you put in the ground, you bring up these little pieces of gray shale. Well, that gray shale has high amounts of mineralizable ammonium within it, non-exchangeable ammonia, 65 million years old plus, and it's acting like a slow-release fertilizer in the Langdon area. So if you have those kinds of soils, then there's no reason at all why you can't credit some of the nitrogen that's coming out of those shales, because it certainly showed itself when we were doing our wheat work, and I have no doubt it is present in all the other crops, including canola. So I promise you some evidence that that yields really don't matter, and these two graphs I think depict that. So the bottom line here, those of you that aren't color challenged, it's red to yellow here. This bottom set of curves, those are the open pollinated varieties that were tested at Hettinger in 2003, and these are the hybrids tested in 2003. And the peak of those curves is in this area from about 110 to 130 pounds of N, which corresponds very nicely, amazingly, that in our 120 pound recommendation. And it doesn't matter the yield the potential, or what do you think is going to happen. That's your economically optimum nitrogen rate. And the same goes with Langdon. They're not separated out quite so much as they are down here at Hettinger, The open pollinated with no nitrogen had about the same rate of return as the hybrids, but once you start putting nitrogen on, then the yields go up in both of those situations, and the economic return is about the same and peaks out between 140 and 160 pounds of N. So the yield doesn't matter, so forget about it. These recommendations have supported yields and trials of over 4,000 pounds an acre, and so I'm very confident that what's pushing the yield is the environment and not so much the nitrogen. So we put enough nitrogen out there to support the yield, and then the environment does the rest. So the next nutrient I want to address is phosphorus, and we have a chart that I'll show you here in a little bit. But it's really important, and a lot of canola growers do this, but I'm also very amazed that some people don't. It's really important to apply seed place or near seed place band at planting time. Canola is not mycorrhizal supportive, and it's the case in sugar beets as well, that a starter band of P hugely replaces larger amounts that might be broadcast. It just, there's not the hyphae helper from the mycorrhiza to gather the phosphate into the plant, and so putting it there really close to the root is the most efficient way. A lot of the research that's been done on phosphate in the last 15 years doesn't even consider broadcast phosphorus anymore. It's just so evident from previous research back in the 80s and the 90s by the Canadians, and that banded P is important, that nobody even considers that as an option anymore. So you shouldn't either. So if your planter isn't tooled up to do this, you need to make sure it is. So low rates of P2O5 yield more canola than 2 to 4 times that much broadcast P in studies that have a response to phosphorus. So consider that very strongly. The caution with that is that the amount of fertilizer you can put with the seed with canola is less than that with wheat, and there's a chart that I'll show you in a minute, and the chart also appears in our publication. And so just make sure that the N plus K2O that's in the starter band is less than what that critical level says, and you should be fine. And here it is. So these are the maximum rates of seed place N plus K2O for canola. And don't feverishly write this down, because it will be in the publication that Hans and Greg will send out to everybody. So there's no need for that. And you can also pull that publication down on my website or the NDSU extension publication website. So it's really nice stuff. So soil texture, light, medium, heavy. This means sandy. This means loamy. This means more clay, like you would get maybe in North Pembina County, perhaps. And these are the seed spreads here. So this is with a disc. If you're putting it down with a drill, and then with the various hoe drills and sweeps and things. So it increases as the spread increases, and also increases with the amount of clay that's in the soil, and it assumes that that's going to be some moisture. For years where it's not very moist, you might back it down a little bit. But I don't think anybody pushes these rates all that hard. So, but just keep that in mind, that it's more important than wheat, and don't blithely put the same rate of fertilizer on that you would for wheat. That might be a mistake. These are the nitrogen, phosphate, potash recommendations for canola: 120 pounds in warmer, drier, 150 in the moisture. The P recommendations, the K recommendations are the same for both places. The lower the soil test, the higher the amount of P that's required. But this year the phosphate prices are really high. Of course, the canola price is pretty high too. So maybe they cancel each other out. But if your bank is on your case and operating is very tight, then shaving some of these rates off a little bit, it would probably be okay. So I'll leave that up to you to figure out the economics of that. The nutrient where canola is so unique compared to other crops is sulfur. There's no crop on the planet that I know of, is certainly not any that we grow that has a particular need for sulfur. We've seen sulfur deficiency in all kinds of crops in the last 15 years, but the yield increase that you get from sulfur, if it happens to be low, is quite remarkable and not seen in any other studies we have. My favorite study is still by Ed Dybert and Scott Haley back in 95, 96. And it was done by landscape position up by Rock Lake. And with the zero sulfur rate, we're looking at on the Buse hilltops, the eroded hilltops, only 30 pounds of canola. And when we put 20 pounds of sulfur as ammonium sulfate, we increase the yield 5,000%, I think that is. So just amazing the amount of yield increase you get for that. In a similar situation with wheat, you might achieve maybe double the yield, but this is just incredible. And they were seeing very, very large yield increases on the barn side slope where there was stock topsoil, but still just huge yield increases, and the Svea and the toe slope still had a yield increase there. So the rate didn't make a whole lot of difference. There's no stats difference between this and this. They're pretty similar. But when we get down to elemental sulfur, and this is Tiger 90, it was a really finely divided sulfur. And you still hear marketing say that if you have really finely divided sulfur, that it's going to be available to plants. Well, I guess, yeah, it's not zero, right? It increased the yield from 30 to 620, which is pretty amazing. But look at how much you left on the table. You left 1,000 pounds of canola on the table because you decided to go this route rather than use an available sulfate form. So we don't know definitely why we don't have the oxidation of elemental sulfur that marketers say that we should have. Maybe it's because we don't have the right bugs, or our pHs tend to be in the slightly acid to alkaline range, and the thiobacillus that are the most efficient in oxidizing sulfide and sulfur to sulfate don't operate very well at those low pHs. So our oxidizing organisms are probably things like fungi that use sulfur as an oxidizer when nothing else is around, but it doesn't really have to, and so the rate of oxidation is just really, really slow. So if you have a product, let's say that you have a product that says it's 20% sulfur, but half of it is elemental sulfur, I would just consider the 10% that's sulfate, and I wouldn't even give any credit to the elemental sulfur at all, because you don't know what the rate of oxidation of that is, and it's certainly not going to be 100%. So if you have to supplement your phosphate source, for example, with some ammonium sulfate, then go ahead. There is some concern of people as you go west, certainly not around Langdon where the pHs are 7.5 to 8, but as you get closer to Minot where you have more acidic pH and you have long-term no-till, there's some major stratification of really acid pHs out in those areas, and farmers are worried that using ammonium sulfate is going to decrease the pH more rapidly than if you used another source. But the amount of ammonium sulfate we're putting on here is pretty low, and it's not that the contribution to acidity isn't going to be zero, but the value of the sulfate with the canola is worth a lot more than any acidification you get with this amount of ammonium sulfate toward its oxidation and acidity. So at some point, people in that more acid region are going to have to consider liming with beet lime probably from Sydney, or municipal waste lime from Minot or some of the other larger cities. That's just going to happen. It just has to happen. Last year around Minot, there was manganese toxicity in canola, and those images ran around. Of course, not the whole field was affected, but certainly parts of the field. When you get to the pHs in the low 4s, you're in serious trouble, you know, with any crop that you want to grow. So you have to look at that when you start soil testing this next fall. Make sure that you sample in zones and address those really, really low pHs in your field, because it's here. So that covers all the bases. That the nitrogen rate is based regionally, and I show you those maps. The phosphate is best applied in the band close to the row at planting time. You use the potassium as needed. Most of you won't have to worry about that. If you do need it, it's N plus K2O in those seed charts. So it'll have to be a broadcast application, probably with your nitrogen source. And then sulfur always, and don't rely on the sulfur soil test because it's garbage. It's not diagnostic, so don't believe it. Just don't believe it. Whatever it says, don't believe it. So 20 pounds per acre of sulfur always is a sulfate form. If you're a liquid person, and there's a few out there, then thiosulfate is certainly acceptable because it doesn't go through that same oxidation thing. Even though it's SO3, it changes to SO4 very, very quickly in the soil. So that's possible, but you definitely don't want to put that with the seed. It's like liquid fire.